This week, we're talking about setting the stage in the right way. These days, we're all doing so much more virtual presenting. So it really is important that you set things up the right way, set yourself up for success. I realized early on this year that I would be pivoting toward almost exclusive online presenting. So I made sure that I did my homework and I tested out quite a few things. I made a lot of observations. And what I'm going to do in this lesson is share all of those observations with you. These are slight adjustments that you can make to the way that you present. And then you can just simply follow through using these things every time, knowing that you're actually following best practices. So, I've put together a checklist of the things that you can do to set yourself up the right way. And then we're going to talk about what you need to do to make sure you're utilizing the technology in the right way. And again, these are best practices. Once you set them in place and commit yourself to doing it this way consistently, it won't be that hard to be a really good virtual presenter. Let's start with checklist number one. Here we have varying aspects of your virtual setup. I'm going to discuss them briefly, and then I'm going to literally point them out to you utilizing the virtual setup that I'm using to present to you right now. So, the first thing to consider is your camera framing. In other words, you want to make sure that the camera is looking at you eye to eye. Make sure that your camera, wherever it is positioned, either in your laptop, as part of your setup, or as a separate camera, is on eye level. It's really crucial that we don't get any of those up the nose shots. Also, in terms of the framing of your camera, you can adjust the position to make sure that you've got the most flattering use of your space. I always tell everyone, make sure that the top framing that you see on your screen just almost touches the top of your hair, therefore giving you enough room to be able to show that you're gesturing. Some of the things that we've covered in earlier sessions and lessons and weeks still apply here when you're virtually presenting. Make sure that you're able to utilize those gestures and people are able to see them. They do have an impact. Making sure that your camera is not too low is very important. Your front lighting is extremely important. It is the lighting that helps you to show up. So is your back lighting. You want to make sure that it's not stronger than your front lighting because what's behind you, although it is important, is not as important as you showing up in the frame. The other thing that I caution everyone about is watch out for windows. Weather changes, lighting, sunlight changes through windows, even shaded windows. And we've all experienced when good lighting, we're relying on the good lighting of a sunny day. Once that shifts, suddenly you can be thrown into darkness, which is disconcerting and disconnecting when you are working online. The next thing on our checklist is your backgrounds. Make sure that your background has all of the right components. Where you shoot is really an example, a utilization of three of what I believe are the best backgrounds to shoot into. And that would be shooting into a corner, which allows for any bend as you move out in the frame to not be as noticeable. It also gives you a sense of expanse moving out. The other possible background that you can utilize is to place a bookcase behind you. And the third one is to use a fireplace, which always looks nice, a nice strong uh, bit of decor to have behind you. So there are some do's and there are some don'ts. And really, the putting together of all of these came from me doing my research earlier in this year and watching everyone who was suddenly presenting virtually, especially professional broadcasters, what they were using in their homes. And these were some of the best practices that I saw and I'm sharing with you. The last thing I want to make sure you have on your checklist is that you check to make sure that your background is creating an invitation. It should speak to some of your preferences. It should be an invitation into your world. Make sure that you balance color. Have a little bit of varying colors, not too many monochromatic colors, not too many just black, white, and gray. Add a little bit of color in there. It just makes it a little bit more interesting. And don't be afraid to be personal. Don't be afraid to have something that has some meaning to you. You never know when it might connect with someone. Of course, be careful about how personal you are with that. But what I'm saying is, don't be afraid of it. So there's your checklist for your setup. We're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail right now. Camera framing, just to go back for a moment, if your camera lens, if the camera is not almost looking you right in the eye, you're going to get that strange look. You don't want to be shooting up your nose because if you are looking at your camera, it's not a really flattering look for most people. I can't even put mine down on the desk, but if it was really low right on my desk right now, it would actually be shooting right up my nose if I just left it on the desk and let the camera do what the camera would do. The other thing you don't want to do is to have so much white space up there in combination with a camera that's not looking you right in the eye. So again, too much space above your head is distracting. These are some of the best techniques when utilizing a camera in a virtual space. Even if you have it at eye level, still, if you shoot it like this, you still have the same problem. It's distracting to have all of that space up above. Now, in terms of front lighting, you can utilize floor lamps, you can utilize desk lamps, but make sure that they're in front of you. I highly advise, just for consistency's sake, that you do invest a little bit of money in buying a front light. They're also referred to as selfie lights, and I'm going to pull one into frame right now so you get an idea of what they look like. And they're not really that expensive. They vary anywhere from $30 to $70, depending. And you can get them online and get them shipped and then utilize them. They even have some that can just clip on to your laptop, just to one side of your camera. And that will give you a good front light so that you show up. Backlighting, you have to be careful. Now, I know everyone is utilizing a space that is not necessarily put together to be a virtual presenting space. You may be at your dining room table, you may be in your living room, you may be in an extra bedroom. Honestly, I'm in an extra bedroom that has suddenly become my studio. So you may have to do some rearranging of the furniture to make sure that you have both the front lighting and the back lighting in the right positions. Just because a lamp is behind you doesn't mean it can't be moved to be in front of you. It may take a little bit of time. And again, in all honesty and transparency, it takes me about 5 minutes to set up this room the way that you see it. So front lighting is important. Backlighting, you can have a little bit of it, but be careful. You don't want your backlight to outshine what's going on right up front. So the next thing that you want to make sure you do is watch out for those windows. I have one just to my side right here, and occasionally it will throw the lighting off when suddenly the sun comes out from behind the clouds. I can utilize that as an ambient light source, but you notice I'm not shooting into the window. I'm also not relying on that window to be my primary front light, because if suddenly it goes behind the clouds again, I'm in darkness. And I realize Some of you may be lucky enough to have an amazing view through that window. But again, you are at the mercy of the weather. So please be careful of that. The next thing is your background. If you notice, I am in fact shooting into a corner, and there it is. So the walls go this way out. Now, I could utilize a bookcase, though I made the choice because I don't have one here in the room with me to not do that. However, and I do have a fireplace, but it's not as easy for me, given the traffic, to be able to shoot in front of the fireplace and have the right conducive environment to do these kinds of videos. So again, you get to make that choice too about where you shoot. Experiment a little bit. If you can combine some of them, you have a room that has a bookcase and you could shoot into the corner and the bookcase is part of that. That's a wonderful look. And just make sure that the bookcase is tidy enough. It doesn't have to be immaculate, and the books don't have to be indicative of highly expert advice. Some of them can be books of all books of your choice, books that actually are on the bookcase, in the bookcase and on the bookshelves. So those are some of the backgrounds you want to use. Now, when I talk about composing your background and making sure that you have some color and you also have some personal items, I've made some choices here in the background that you see. One of them is to include one of my favorite movies, which probably comes as no surprise to many of you, and that is The King's Speech, which was in my studio in New York City and would often get a lot of comments. So when I was no longer working in that studio earlier this year, I did think enough to grab that picture and put it up here because it still is one of my favorite movies. Also, you'll see I have a backup microphone here that I don't often use, but it does give an indication that you're in a speech coach's studio. So it's a little indicative of some of the personal items that I enjoy, some of those items that are a part of that invitation into my world. I also do like having a plant, and that green color always looks really nice. And I've got a little red lamp here that, up until doing virtual presenting, really didn't do much for anyone because it didn't give off much light, but it's a nice little splash of red. So if you can look for things like that to put in your background, it's appealing. Just having a blank wall behind you looks it just doesn't look as interesting as it could be. So, yes, this is a composed environment. Some of these things that you're seeing stay right where they are. The majority of them do, but my positioning shooting into this corner doesn't always stay the same. So, there is a little bit of effort that goes into it, but I have a system. I have figured out what works for me, and I want you to figure out what works for you. So these are just some of my tips in terms of the background and in terms of the front lighting and the framing that you should use in your virtual presenting. Now, in terms of utilizing the technology in the right way, you really want to take a moment or two to familiarize yourself with the technology. Understand where the various buttons are, where the various preferences are, because sometimes you need to make adjustments on the fly. It happens. Make sure you know where the video on off controller is, as well as where the audio is in your online program. Know how to adjust that. Be familiar with, in that program, going to preferences. If, for instance, a microphone is not working, sometimes the computer is not recognizing that the program is utilizing that mic. Sometimes, if you're using a program for the first time, maybe at the request of a client, you may have to go into the preferences and give permission to both use the camera and to use the microphone. If you're working with a program for the first time, definitely add a little bit of time in the beginning to see if you can get on. Once you get on the program, and even if you have not been invited yet into the meeting, you can make some adjustments to those parameters, to those preferences, video and audio being the most important. And then take a look, make sure your framing is good, make sure that everything that you want to do, the sound is coming through. If you're using the program for the first time and it says test mic, do it just to make sure. The other thing you want to look at is, how do I share my screen? If you are presenting client facing and you do have slides as part of what you're doing, understand what it takes to share that screen. What is the pathway that I utilize to get there as quickly as possible, just to minimize the downtime? Because when there is a lag going on between you presenting and keeping that forward momentum going, that can often be that moment where people decide they're going to start looking at their phones. And we all know that's a difficult one. The other thing is, understand where the recording features are and make sure your preferences are put in. If you're the person who's running the meeting, understand where those recording preferences are, what those features are, and make sure that you let everyone know that you are recording and that they're okay with it. They should be, but it's always just a really good policy to ask. Now, when we're talking about guiding people through, I have often heard from clients that some of the parameters of presentations and public speaking that were obstacles and difficult challenges one-on-one and in person are really magnified when we're presenting virtually. And one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest obstacles to overcome is anticipating the lag time. Not that you're anticipating it, but having to deal with it. So I do want you to anticipate that there will be lag time. Often people are not familiar with jumping in the virtual environment. So you want to make sure that you do two things. You want to make sure that you rephrase your questions several times, and also you anticipate and ask people to unmute. So let's talk about that for just a moment. What do I mean by rephrasing your questions? Well, when you want participation, and you know there's going to be a little bit of lag time, because most of the time people will mute their microphones just so that ambient noise doesn't muddy up what is going on in the presentation. So you do want to be able to rephrase a question so it gives people time to think about whether they have an answer and whether they want to be the first one to jump in. Rephrasing the question keeps you in control. You are still moving things forward. So be prepared. I know you're probably going to have a couple of Q&A opportunities. Be prepared to rephrase that question in several different ways, depending on how much lag time is required, to make sure that there's a seamless handoff from the question to whoever is going to offer the first answer. So in other words, simply stating who would like to comment on that and then just waiting for someone to think about it can really slow down and cause there to be a big hole in what you're presenting. So what I suggest is that you say, would anyone like to comment on that? What I've just said, does that spark any ideas that may be related to experiences that you've had? Does anybody think that maybe that approach could be adjusted in a different way? Do you see the way I'm rephrasing these questions? What I'm really doing is just keeping the ball in the air and waiting for someone to jump in. The other thing you want to do when it is a matter of you choosing who your volunteers are going to be, make sure that you give that person a little bit of time to unmute their microphone. I always suggest, if you know that you're going to ask someone, say, Bob, could you unmute your microphone? The question that I would love to hear your perspective on is this, and then again, give the question again so that they have an opportunity to unmute, settle, and be able to deliver. That's the way a good presenter handles the anticipation of lag time. And it can be more pronounced when you're doing this in a virtual environment. All of these tips are meant to make virtual presenting a little bit easier. Some of them you can take care of in your initial setup. Many of them you should, because this environment should be one where you can thrive. As much as we will be going back to more in person and one on one live presenting, the virtual side of presenting is something that we will all be doing to a certain extent, to a certain percentage. So you want to have this ready to go and to feel good about doing either one, because you never know what you're going to be asked to do. So you might as well do it to the best of your ability. Remove any of those virtual obstacles.